Chapter 1. A whiff of berries and the still pond. The first rays of sunlight crept into Barnaby's den, painting golden stripes across the dusty floor. He blinked his amber eyes open, but the usual thrill of a new day was absent. Instead, a familiar knot of anxiety twisted in his belly. His family, a flurry of gray fur and excited yips, were already up, their voices bouncing off the earthen walls as they planned the morning's hunt. They spoke of the thrill of the chase, the satisfying snap of bones, and the glorious feast to follow. Barnaby shivered, not with excitement but with a deep unease. He looked longingly at the sunspots warming the floor, wishing he could spend the day basking in the light instead. "Come on, slowpoke," his mother chuckled, her breath smelling of the night's kill. "Don't want to miss all the fun." Barnaby mustered a weak smile and whimpered a polite "no thank you," his tail tucked low. His mind raced with visions of plump, juicy berries rather than scurrying rabbits. He dreamed of sun-warmed blackberries, their deep purple juice staining his muzzle, the earthy tang of forest mushrooms sautéed with fragrant herbs. A low grumble from his stomach reminded him he was hungry, not for meat, but for the delicate flavors that thrived in the undergrowth. Barnaby pushed himself to his paws. The other pups had already bounded outside, eager for the hunt, while Barnaby felt as if a weight pulled him the other way. He gave a small, wistful sigh as he watched a particularly bright sun spot, then pushed out through the den opening, and towards the whispering woods. The first rays of dawn crept into Barnaby's den, painting the earthen floor with patches of pale gold. He lay curled in a ball, his fluffy tail twitching, not from excitement but a flutter of anxiety in his belly. His family stirred around him, their low growls and eager yips filling the space. They were discussing the hunt, their voices alive with anticipation. But the thought of chasing prey made Barnaby's stomach turn. He instead watched the sunbeams dance on the floor, his mind drifting towards plump, juicy berries and the sweet, earthy scent of mushrooms, imagining them in various combinations. He hummed to himself quietly, wondering what interesting things might be happening in the sun outside the den. With a sigh, Barnaby unfurled himself, his paws stretching out in front of him. He gave his family a small, polite whine, a gesture of polite refusal, as his mother nuzzled his head briefly before heading out. Barnaby watched them leave, feeling a familiar pang of loneliness. He knew he was different, but it was always a struggle to reconcile what his family expected and the things he truly enjoyed. He then padded out of the den, leaving the familiar sense of his family behind, instead breathing in the damp forest air. His plan for the morning, like every morning, was clear: foraging, experimenting with new flavor combinations and avoiding the inevitable rough play of the other young wolves. Barnaby's paws padded softly on the mossy ground as he ventured deeper into the woods. His large amber eyes scanned the undergrowth, seeking out the telltale signs of ripeness. Soon, he spotted a cluster of vibrant red berries, nestled amongst the rocks. They looked juicy and plump, perfect for his new jam recipe. However, they were perched precariously on top of a large, slippery rock. Barnaby tilted his head, assessing the situation, and let out a small giggle before giving a running start. He leaped towards the rock, his claws scrabbling for purchase. The moss gave way beneath him, and with a surprised yelp, Barnaby tumbled to the muddy ground, a shower of leaves and dirt erupting around him. He lay there for a moment, disoriented and covered in muck, then gave himself a shake and stood on shaky paws, a nervous giggle escaping his lips. A high-pitched giggle interrupted his thoughts. Barnaby looked up to see Bella the squirrel perched on a nearby branch. She twitched her bushy tail and chirped. Well, Barnaby, what a clumsy sight, berry-picking by mud bath, is it?" Her eyes twinkled with amusement before she scurried away, leaving Barnaby feeling a bit worse than before. He sighed. the fleeting social contact having done little to ease his loneliness. The weight of his isolation grew, the brief interaction serving only to further highlight his otherness. He felt his ears droop slightly, his usual sunny disposition taking a hit as he looked down at his muddy paws, a deep-seated melancholy settling over him. He shook his head again as he couldn't shake off the sadness he was feeling as he stared at the muddy tracks his paws had left in the soft earth. Barnaby trudged onward, his shoulders slumped as he made his way through the dense undergrowth. He had almost given up on the idea of finding anything at all, and the thought of returning to his den with nothing felt too difficult to bear. The usual happy hop in his stride had diminished to a slow, heavy gait. Soon he arrived by the edge of a small, still pond. He gazed into its depths, the reflections of the sky and trees creating a rippling canvas on the water's surface, a sort of mirror to the sad feelings inside. He was about to turn and go the other way, anywhere else, when a soft, raspy voice startled him. "Lost, little one." Barnaby's head jerked up, his amber eyes wide. He saw a large, moss-covered shape emerge from beneath a shaded nook, the form of Old Man Tortoise. He blinked a few times, looking closely, surprised that he hadn't noticed him sooner. Barnaby hesitantly stepped forward, his paws leaving muddy prints on the bank. "Oh, hello," he whimpered, trying to sound braver than he felt. I'm Barnaby, and yes, I suppose I am a bit lost." He paused a moment, looking down at his muddy paws, and then his eyes widened before he quickly looked up to Old Man Tortoise again. "And I didn't mean to disturb you. I was just on my way, I will just go." His words tumbled out in a nervous rush as he gestured back towards the forest edge. The thought of further isolating himself from this gentle-sounding creature felt worse than the thought of going back to his den. Old Man Tortoise studied him for a moment, his ancient eyes calm and knowing. He had not had a visitor in a very long time, and a flicker of interest danced within his gaze. "You seem troubled, young one. What has befallen you to make your little wolf face so long?" he asked, his voice slow and deliberate. He slowly turned his head slightly, curious, as he gently placed his chin onto the mossy earth. Barnaby fidgeted, his tail tucked between his legs. He felt a sudden urge to tell Old Man Tortoise about everything: the hunting, the clumsy attempts to find berries, and Bella's laughter. But instead he simply said, "I can't reach the berries." He gestured vaguely back the way he had come, embarrassed to show the elder his failed attempts. Old Man Tortoise slowly turned his massive body and looked in the direction that Barnaby had motioned, his gaze as steady as his slow movement. A few long moments passed before he then shuffled towards the small slippery rock, his pace unhurried and steady. Then without another word he slowly stretched his neck out, carefully reaching the berries and gently plucked them from their stems, and gently offered them to Barnaby. Barnaby's eyes widened in surprise. He had never seen a creature move with such deliberation and such grace. His heart began to beat a little faster as a warm glow spread through him. He took the berries gently from Old Man Tortoise and almost whispered his gratitude. "Oh, thank you ever so much." He suddenly found himself brimming with an eagerness to talk and show his gratitude for this kindness. "I was going to use these in my new special recipe. I've been experimenting with a sweet jam. I even think I've perfected the texture and consistency. It's really quite special, you see," he said. NLY trailed off, feeling nervous about babbling so quickly. He took a deep breath and giggled. Old Man Tortoise watched him with gentle curiosity, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He noticed the way Barnaby looked at the berries and saw that same glimmer of joy he'd once found so easily himself when he was a younger creature. It felt almost alien to him, and yet warm and inviting. "Recipes?" he echoed, tilting his head to the side. "Tell me more, young wolf." His old heart felt lighter, and a quiet, hesitant hope began to sprout within his aged soul. Barnaby's face lit up, his earlier gloom completely forgotten. He began to ramble about his berry creations, his voice infused with a newfound excitement. He described his jam recipes, the specific taste profiles of each different berry, the techniques that he used, and even the best method for the most efficient wild foraging. His descriptions had an almost magical quality to them, the descriptions painting vivid scenes of color and taste, and making the simplest of berries sound like the most luxurious of things. Old Man Tortoise listened, captivated by the young wolf's enthusiasm. He felt a flicker of warmth, a feeling he had not experienced in decades, and realized that what he had mistaken for isolation had become a very painful loneliness. As he listened to Barnaby's stories, a slow awareness filled him. He wasn't so very different after all. "You have a rare gift, young Barnaby," he finally said when Barnaby paused for breath and then gave a very soft, encouraging nod. "And it seems that we have more in common than I had initially thought." Barnaby's tail thumped softly against the earth, his eyes sparkling. "Really, you think so?" he whispered. He carefully sat down near the old tortoise, offering some of the berries back, and then they began to eat, a companionable silence settling between them as the morning sun continued its slow, golden journey across the sky, dappling their spot in the glade. Barnaby felt happy and for the first time in a very long while, completely at peace. Old Man Tortoise also found something too that he thought had left him many long years ago: hope. Chapter 2. The Great Ruffle and the Wisdom of the Berries. The first rays of dawn struggled to pierce through the thick, gray clouds that hung low over the whispering woods. A steady, relentless rain had been falling through the night, transforming the familiar forest into a landscape of muddy chaos. Small streams had swollen into rushing torrents, their waters gurgling menacingly as they surged around the bases of trees. Panic was setting in. A chorus of anxious whimpers and panicked chirps echoed through the undergrowth. Bella the squirrel darted from tree to tree, her usually bushy tail flattened against her back, her bright eyes wide with fear as she chattered about flooded dens. Even the wolves, usually so sure and stoic, looked uneasy. Barnaby's family were huddled together near their den entrance, their noses twitching, ears flattened against their heads as they remembered the old stories, passed down for generations, about the Great Ruffle, a time of starvation, of struggle, of true panic. Muddy water had surrounded the tree trunks, and the usual hiding spots had been overwhelmed. Barnaby watched the scene unfold with a knot of dread in his stomach. The sight of the normally bustling berry patches, now flattened and submerged, made his heart sink. He thought of the juicy wild strawberries, their bright red color usually a welcome sight, now just a dull stain in the muddy water. The usually reliable food sources were ruined, and a chilling fear washed over him, more profound than the cold rain soaking his fur. The chatter of the other animals turned into sharp, frightened barks. He caught a snippet of conversation from his father as he tried to keep the other pack members calm, but even he seemed shaken, which made the worry worse. Old resentments were surfacing. Some animals began bickering, and his father's voice rose above the rest, his tone sharp with irritation as he argued with one of the smaller badger families. The anxiety was a heavy blanket over the forest now, and Barnaby shivered. A wave of despair washed over him. He longed to curl up in his den, but he knew he couldn't. The thought of his belly, usually full with foraged items, rumbling with emptiness, was enough to drive him further. Barnaby racked his brain, desperate for a solution to the situation. His gaze wandered upwards and he frowned. There, through the branches of the tall trees, he could see that the dark gray mushrooms clung to the high rock formations and had been protected from the flood waters. He paused and thought about what he had learnt over the last day. Could that be the answer? An idea began to form, a small, hopeful spark in the darkness of his fear. The morning began with a low rumble, not the usual gentle rustling of leaves, but a deep growl that shook the very ground of the whispering woods. Rain lashed down with a ferocity that was new to many of the younger creatures, the sound battering against their homes. Muddy water began to creep around tree trunks, and the low hum of anxious murmuring rippled through the woods. Bella the squirrel chattered nervously from a branch, her bushy tail drooping with rain. The usual paths became treacherous streams as the storm raged. Fear was a tangible thing, hanging thick in the air as the animals remembered hushed tales of the Great Ruffle, a time of great hardship. Barnaby's den was damp, his normally fluffy tail flattened against his legs, his amber eyes wide as he watched the water level rise around the roots of their den tree. The usual berry patches that Barnaby loved were quickly becoming submerged, the precious bounty either washed away or spoiled by the rising waters. Panic started to set in, the easygoing nature of the woods dissolving into hurried movements and frightened whispers. "What will we do? The berries." "They're all gone," a young rabbit cried, its whiskers twitching. A small group started to argue, blame and fear rising in equal measure. Barnaby felt a knot of dread forming in his belly, the fear around him making him feel even more isolated. He looked at the water, then at his own muddy paws, the sight somehow making him want to whimper. Then a thought like a tiny spark ignited within him. He remembered the high rock faces, areas he'd often tried to climb when trying to reach the highest berries, and Old Man Tortoise's words. They had spoken about the mushrooms that grew on the rocky outcrops, how they could be used in different ways, not just for cooking but also medicinal use. "Maybe," Barnaby mumbled to himself, looking at the flooded berry patch. An idea began to take shape, something different, something that he had learnt from his unusual approach to life. He found the courage to push through the anxious crowd of animals, his heart pounding against his ribs. He tentatively approached the elder wolves, his father at the forefront. "Father," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "the mushrooms on the high rocks, they might still be safe." The response was immediate and harsh. "Mushrooms," his father scoffed, his lip curling. "That's not wolf food. That's not how we deal with things. We hunt, not forage for strange growths on rocks." The other wolves mumbled in agreement, their faces contorted with confusion. Barnaby shrunk back, the weight of their disapproval pressing down on him. He almost gave up, the familiar feeling of self-doubt creeping back in. He glanced at the mudded floor, a whimper escaping his lips. He could see in his mind's eye, his paws trying desperately to climb the rocks that had defeated him before, and his body felt leaden. But then he heard, as clear as if it had been whispered into his ear, Old Man Tortoise's voice. "There is value in all things, even things that look different. Trust your instincts, young one, and do not doubt the gifts that you possess." He remembered the words with crystal clarity, and for a moment, his amber eyes flickered, gaining a new glint of determination. "But," Old Man Tortoise said, Barnaby began, his voice gaining strength. He spoke of types of mushrooms and their uses. Some of the ones on the high rocks, they're edible and very nutritious. He even showed me ways to cook them, he added, his voice rising with each word, his tail beginning to twitch slightly. The wolves looked at him as if he had suddenly grown a second head. Even his father was puzzled, the disbelief clear on his face, his ears flattened against his head. He scoffed loudly, his usual gruff tone extra forceful, but Barnaby could see a small flicker of interest behind his stern facade. Taking a deep breath, Barnaby moved away from the pack towards a rocky outcrop that overlooked the flooded areas. It was steep and treacherous, and he could see how the water rushed below him, but somehow he wasn't as afraid as he should have been. He began to climb, his claws finding holds in the wet stone, his earlier failures replaced by a new determination. He moved with an unexpected grace, the same clumsy movements from earlier replaced by a focus and purpose that he had not felt before. He was climbing for the future, for the community. As he climbed higher, some of the younger creatures looked on. Some whispered comments started to circulate. Even Bella had stopped chattering for a moment, watching him with wide eyes. When Barnaby finally reached the top, his head poked out over the rock ledge. A small smile flickered across his face, despite the rain. His unexpected appearance and the knowledge he shared were enough to spark the curiosity of the others. The other creatures, despite their fear, cautiously started to approach. "There are several types," Barnaby explained, his voice clear and confident as he showed the mushrooms, pointing out specific features and colors that indicated the safe varieties. "See this one. It's called the sun puff. It's safe to eat and tastes great when baked over the fire," he said, pulling out some of the mushrooms he'd managed to gather. With Barnaby taking the lead, and some hesitant help from Bella, the other woodland creatures soon began collecting the high-growing mushrooms. They realized Barnaby's difference in experience gave them a new way to approach an old issue. That evening, a large fire crackled in the heart of the woods. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, but the community was gathered around the flames, sharing a feast of cooked mushrooms that Barnaby had prepared, using the recipes he and Old Man Tortoise had worked on together. They also began to share stories of the past, and Old Man Tortoise was invited to share his own experiences, his stories filling the air. The air was thick with the smell of roasted mushrooms and the sounds of laughter and quiet conversation. Barnaby, seated beside Old Man Tortoise, felt a warmth spread through his chest, a sense of belonging that had eluded him for so long. He was no longer the wolf who eats berries. He was Barnaby, a unique and valuable member of the community. Old Man Tortoise watched, his gentle eyes crinkling at the corners. A soft sigh escaped his lips. He had found connection again and knew he was exactly where he should be, surrounded by community. His wisdom had guided not only Barnaby, but had begun the change he'd longed to see.